You aren't good enough, smart enough, thin enough, or cool enough. These are the kinds of lies that our inner critics can spew if they're left unchecked. In his new book, Make Peace with Your Mind, renowned meditation teacher Mark Coleman explains how mindfulness and compassion can free us from our inner critic, and he offers practical tools we can use to radically shift the way we think and feel. I hope you'll enjoy this recent conversation I had with Mark about the book. What is the inner critic, and does everyone have one?
So I would say that most people have some version of a self-critical, self-judging mind. The mind that gives you a hard time, that's always on your case, that's critical, unforgiving, punishing, pushing, driving, demanding. So that's the critic. It's the part of the mind that's ceaselessly critical, judgmental, and giving you a hard time about what you do, what you say, what you've done. Doesn't let you off the hook. A negatively toned habit that hangs around and follows you around and judges your every move.
And do you think that the inner critic is something that most people are aware of, or could it also be operating kind of under the surface that we don't even know that it's kind of affecting us?
Yeah, I think most people don't realize they have a critic. It's just me, or it's just my mind, or it's just the way I talk to myself, or it's just the way I see myself. So I think most people don't even have a word for it. But when I say, hey, does anybody give themselves a hard time, or does anybody have that kind of controlling, demanding, critical, driving voice, they'll say, oh yeah, I've got one of those.
Yeah, can relate.
Yeah.
And do you think that everyone's inner critic is the same, or does it show up in different ways in different people?
No, I think it's very different for different people. It has a similar tone of being hard and harsh and negative, but there's a lot of words that I use in the book, like controller, like the driver, like the meanie, the itty bitty shitty committee, as somebody called it. So many different types, you know. Sometimes the critic goes in more than it goes out, sometimes both, but there's a whole variety of critical voices.
What do you mean by goes in more than goes out?
So the critic generally that I'm referring to in the book is about how we judge ourselves, how we're down on ourselves, how we push ourselves and give ourselves impossibly high standards. Mm-hmm. But that same critical voice also goes outwards in that it judges other people for the same things and puts them through the same impossible demands.
Right. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
You write in the introduction to Make Peace with Your Mind that to navigate life's inner and outer storms, we need two essential skills: awareness and compassion. So will you talk about those two skills and how they relate to the inner critic?
Yeah. So in my experience, I've been teaching meditation for 20 years, studying the mind for 30 years in psychology and meditation and other disciplines. And what I've seen is that without awareness, through the doorway of what I call mindfulness practice, we can't really know anything. And so the more awareness, particularly self-awareness, that we have and develop, the more we're going to understand our mind, our thoughts, our habits, our tendencies, our patterns, and the ways that we cause ourselves misery through judging ourselves mercilessly. Mm. And so without that awareness, there's no hope, right? Because we're just going to have those voices and those thoughts, and there's going to be no awareness and no hope of resolution. Mm-hmm. But the awareness isn't enough, in that those voices are also incredibly painful and incredibly harsh and causes for depression and low self-esteem and feeling bad about ourselves. So if we can also meet those voices and the feelings that come from that criticalness with kindness and compassion, then we're going to have these two great tools to both have the awareness and clarity to know when it's happening, how it's happening, why it's happening, what impact it's having. And the compassionate heart, which is holding the painfulness with care and kindness so we can actually move more effectively with it.
Mm. You also say in the introduction that the possibility of change through neuroplasticity underlies this book. So can you explain what neuroplasticity is and why it's so important?
Sure. So neuroplasticity is the capacity for the brain to change and alter its structure and its thinking and its behavior depending on what we do, what habits we enact, and how we pay attention. So, for example, if we've spent the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years being hard on ourselves, then that pattern neurologically gets hardwired. So our brain basically develops these slipstreams, these habits of thinking that get somewhat hardwired into the brain structure. And fortunately, the good news is the brain is plastic in that we always have the capacity to change it in any moment depending on what we do, how we act, how we think, how we behave, what choices we make. And we have the possibility in any moment to change those habits and behaviors. But we can't do that without awareness, without a kindness and care for ourselves. And once we have those tools, then we can begin to interrupt the voice of the critic and, for example, supplant it with a kind voice, with a caring voice, with a positive voice towards ourselves and our behavior. And so we start actually literally neurologically changing the structure of the brain from one that orients more towards the negative to one that actually has a more realistic perspective of who we are and how we live and how we decide and live in the world.
And what it means to be human.
And what it means to be human.
Yeah. What do you think is the most important thing that those of us who are ready to transform our relationship with our inner critic need to know?
Well, I think the first step is we have to see it. We have to recognize it. We have to see every time that we are judging or critical or harsh with ourselves, that we isolate that thought. We bring it into relief and we really clear that's a judging thought that has only negative consequences. So that's the first step in beginning that path of separating out the judging thoughts from the discerning thoughts, from the discriminating thoughts, from any other thought. Once we do that, then we can see when it's operating, how it's impacting, and then we can bring certain tools that I talk about in the book to learn how to disengage from its impact. But we first have to really be clear every time we're judging, do I want to keep developing that habit or do I want to practice letting it go?
Can you give us an example of one of your favorite tools from the book?
One of my favorite tools is humor. So I think humor is one of the most powerful strategies for disengaging from the impact of the critic. Because if we can laugh at something, it means we have a little space, right? We're a little bigger than the problem or the issue, or in this case, the thought. So, for example, the way I first started to use humor was I would imagine my critic like this English judge with a big gray wig, saying bad person. I just ham it up. I'd be playful. I'd just make fun of it.
Yeah.
And it was just one way of not taking that voice so seriously that previously had been very ominous and heavy. And it's like, oh, there's that silly person with the wig on.
What do you most hope people will take away from your book, Make Peace with Your Mind?
I hope that they take away a few things. One is hope, that they see the possibility that they can work with this pattern of the mind and be free from it. And two, a whole set of tools and skills and practices that they can really practically implement and learn how to use every day of their life so they can become more free and more peaceful and more happy within themselves.